From New York Times Opinion, this is The Ezra Klein Show. I'm just going to try to say what we're doing this week as clearly as I can. Before there can be any kind of stable coexistence of peoples in Israel and Palestine, there's going to have to be a stable coexistence of narratives. There's a line I love from Yossi Klein Halevi's book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, where he writes, quote, "We must recognize not only each other's right to self-determination, but also each side's right to self-definition." So you could think of the episodes this week as a matched pair. You could think of it as one episode in two parts. But one is going to be on this moment and the background to it through Palestinian eyes, and the other on this moment and the background to it through Israeli eyes. Obviously, nobody can speak for a whole people. These are just what they claim to be. Historically and journalistically informed perspectives. There are many more. I didn't find everything in these conversations easy to hear. I doubt you will either. I didn't agree with everything I heard, and I doubt you will either. But that's not the spirit in which I'm trying to do these. The point, at least for me, is to simply try and hold these perspectives at the same time, because somehow this land, this cursed, sacred, bloody scar of land, is going to have to hold them and more. My guest today is Amjad Iraqi. He's a senior editor at 972 magazine and a policy analyst at the think tank Al-Shabaka. He's written for the London Review of Books and The Guardian, and formerly worked at Adalah, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel. I appreciated him having this conversation with me. This is not easy stuff to talk about. I got a lot from it, and I hope that you do too. As always, my email, EzraKleinShow@nytimes.com. Amjad Iraqi, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I wanted to begin with what Gaza looked like before the attack on 10/7. And I want to, begin with a more simple question, which is, what was Gaza?
Gaza as we know it today is almost like an imaginary construct. Historically, there was Gaza City. It wasn't a strip. It was a part of what was regarded as historical Palestine that, through different empires and rulers over the years, was this kind of coastal area, which was also one of the sort of port cities and had these other kind of rural areas around it, and was very much one of the major points of Palestinian Arab history in that land. This all naturally changed in 1948 with what's regarded as the Arab-Israeli War, or what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. And whereby after that war, you had Palestine split apart by an armistice lines that were created between the newfound Israeli state and the Arab states around it. And at the time, Gaza was then put onto the Egyptian side. And that formulated that sort of slot of land that we know of today in its shape. Most of the population since 1948 have been refugees or descendants of Palestinian refugees who were either fled or were expelled during that 1948 war. And a lot of these people can literally see the lands from which their families came from just a few kilometers or miles away. And even to this day, those descendants are still living in what are regarded as refugee camps, which now look like permanent settlements in a way, like permanent communities or towns and villages. But they still strongly identify themselves as refugees. I think something like 2/3 of the Gaza Strip's population are technically not from that area. And Gaza has always been very much at the center of, or one of the kind of pillars of Palestinian identity, a Palestinian memory of the region, and certainly in terms of politics and identity and resistance, Gaza has always been very much at the front in many ways of initiating that, of producing Palestinians who created different kinds of politics and so on. I'm emphasizing this especially because there's become this tendency to think of the Gaza Strip as something separate from Palestine and something separate from the Palestinian people in history, but it's really vital to understand how central it is to it. Now, all this has very much been, let's say, deformed after the 1967 occupation, and even more so since the blockade of the Gaza Strip in 2007, whereby the Gaza that we see today is one that is completely encaged by a blockade that was initiated after the Islamist movement Hamas took over the Strip, which itself came after Hamas won democratic elections to the Palestinian government, which was then met by international sanctions led by the Bush administration, and then a Western-backed coup by the rival party Fatah, which is led by Mahmoud Abbas and governs the West Bank. And that blockade has basically been de-developed since 2007. So the infrastructure and the towns and communities' access to basic services have been crippling along the way because of the blockade and its restrictions on movement, on people, on goods, and really formulating this cage and in a very deliberate policy to try to separate Gaza and Hamas, but especially Gaza as a unit, away from the Palestinian people.
So I want to zoom in on two periods here. And the first is when Gaza moves from Egyptian control to Israeli control. Because I think it's also important for people to realize that Gaza is it's almost co-managed between Egypt and Israel even now. So what happens in that moment? How does Gaza go from being something that Egypt has authority over to something that Israel is now controlling?
So in June 1967, you had the Six-Day War between Israel and surrounding Arab states. And within the space of a week, Israel had basically conquered the West Bank from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, and then the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. And this was kind of quite a shocking victory on Israel's end. Later on, the Sinai was eventually ceded back in the negotiations with Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, in the 70s. This was the Camp David Accords. And for Egypt and Israel, and there's been some fantastic research about this, but like just explaining how that the armistice line was then redrawn to the Gaza Strip. And so this is how you kind of formulated that agreement between Israel and Egypt, that Gaza's future lay with the Palestinian people, not with Egypt.
You mentioned this research about how Gaza becomes seen as something that's not going to, in some kind of deal, go back to Egypt, but becomes part of Palestine. And so it becomes a sort of, I don't want to call it unwanted, but Egypt also does not end up wanting to control Gaza. What is that research? What is the narrative of that?
I mean, a huge part of the Palestinian question, especially on the Israeli side, is to try to make the Palestinian issue an Arab problem. So it's always about trying to sort of cast it off to the Arab states, even hoping like in the West Bank that Jordan would just take all the Palestinians and that would be done with it. But the Palestinians themselves, from the very get-go have always resisted this kind of geopolitical game that's been played with them. Even Arab states, which have always had their own agendas and kind of larger visions of the regional architecture, still understood, especially both by the Palestinians who were resisting on the ground, but also a lot of the Arab publics, which to this day are still heavily sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, that the Palestinians needed to be able to assert themselves in their own homeland, that their struggle lay with the future in their land and not just to be kind of dispersed and diluted into this Arab region. So after the trauma of the Nakba, that became basically from the 60s, that Palestinians were really kind of taking a much more concerted, organized agency in order to make the world sort of not forget them, like after 1948, that it wasn't just a done deal and that Palestinians weren't going to be silenced in that respect or just kind of melt away into the region, that they still had aspirations for their own homeland. So Palestinians themselves made it impossible for these other Arab capitals and for the Israeli state to completely ignore them. But for a whole host of reasons, it did not go the way that at least Palestinians have been hoping to.
So go back to 2006 here. There are elections held in Gaza. To some degree, one of the big movers here is the Bush administration over the objections of some who they really want elections. Hamas wins the election. What is Hamas, and what is Hamas at that point, and why do they win?
So Hamas is like a Palestinian Islamist movement. And those two need to be combined because there's a tendency to sort of just kind of dismiss it as kind of like another one of these Islamist groups that has these grand, Islamic caliphate sort of visions for the region. But Hamas has always been very concerted about defining itself as a particularly national movement for the Palestinians. And yes, it has connections to other Islamists. It has a history with the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, and obviously tied in with a lot of Arab capitals and even Iran, for example. But its goal is very much focused on Palestine. And so it originated basically almost like a social movement, I think back in the 70s or even 80s. The early incarnations of it was recognized as an NGO even by the Israeli occupation authorities. And then through a couple of processes, you end up having Hamas emerging out, especially out of the first Intifada in the late 80s, seeing itself as kind of like a religious political model, or a political Islamist model, and one especially that was grounded in historic Palestine itself, in the occupied territories, which was different from the PLO, which was very much born in exile and by the refugees abroad. And in addition to that kind of political Islam, they were also trying to create this challenge to the PLO, which they were seeing as shifting its politics, as we would eventually see with Yasser Arafat moving towards recognition of the two-state solution, the signing of the Oslo Accords, the renouncing of armed struggle. And Hamas has always been very insistent that in addition to its political agenda, that armed struggle needs to be an integral part of Palestinian resistance. So this is what really set it apart, or tried to define itself as being set apart from the Fatah party, which governed the PLO. And it's evolved over the years, and it's a very complex organization. And Tariq Bakaouni wrote a really fantastic book about this called Hamas Contained, where he really provides like a very great, complex analysis of how it was born and fantastic details. And it's important not to think of it as a monolith, whether you approve of the movement or not. It has a political bureau, it has armed wing, it has these debates and these mechanisms that revolve around it. Hamas really defined itself in the 90s with its military struggle, especially of the suicide bombings, which became notorious, including during the Second Intifada. But then in the 2005, 2006 elections, it became like this test to see like, okay, what if we try to use these democratic models? What if we focus on the political rather than the armed struggle and try to really center ourselves at the center of the Palestinian national movement, not just to have Fatah or the PLO dominate, but to be able to really reflect these other political ideas. So it sees itself as trying to become part of this wider spectrum. But the response has just been complete blockage by Fatah, which still sees itself as kind of almost like the sole leader, the sole monopolizer of Palestinian politics. At the time, by international actors, which especially under the rubric of the war on terror, was almost like refusing to have any conversations with political Islamist movements, let alone ones that maintained an armed struggle. And for Hamas's experience, the fact that they participated in elections, won the parliament, and then were sanctioned and then basically ousted from government is for them an indication that they cannot let go of armed struggle. And this is why they, very much unlike Fatah and the PLO, they're still holding on to it. And that's one of the things that has also helped it to maintain a certain status in Palestinian society, where even those who disagree with Hamas ideologically or in its political moves feel that Hamas is still one of the only movements that are still incurring a cost on the Israeli occupation in a way that Fatah no longer is, or that the PLO no longer is.
So two things in there that I want to go into in more detail. So one, after Hamas wins, there's a blockade imposed by Israel. The blockade is also enforced by Egypt, by international actors. And there's this war that happens with Fatah. Can you talk a bit about both what the blockade is and also why Egypt participates in it? And then also the war with Fatah, what happens there?
So you have the 2005 election, which gets Mahmoud Abbas as president, and then the 2006 one where Hamas wins the legislature. And it was very clear from the outset that neither Fatah nor its Western sponsors were going to be accepting of this scenario, that even though Hamas was playing the political game as demanded, the very fact that they could have such popular support and win even by the rules of the game was just unacceptable. And so in the months that ensued afterwards, you basically had constant tensions, the sanctions that were imposed by the European Union, by the Bush administration, just made it impossible for Hamas to even function in government. Like it became almost designed to fail. And all this ended up happening whereby both Fatah and Hamas, with their different sort of security forces or armed groups, ended up almost fighting out into the streets, especially in Gaza, and Hamas won that battle. And then this kind of gave the pretext for Israel to completely enforce this full-on siege. We're talking about severe restrictions at the border crossings, both in terms of making it almost impossible for people to get in and out. And this in addition to just general goods and just basic trade. Like Gaza used to be, part and parcel of the economy of the West Bank, and also inside Israel during the Oslo period, people used to be able to go in and out of Gaza. And in the moment that blockade, and even just before, the months and years before, like when the closure started being in place, it became this highly isolated kind of territorial island in a way. And then for Palestinians in Gaza who've been experiencing the siege, we're talking about an entire generation who've never been out of that strip and who've never seen another Palestinian from the West Bank, who only know Israelis through the tanks and the fighter jets and the Israeli snipers at the border. This is the kind of the harrowing reality. And with each passing year, and especially as the military assaults kept bombarding Gaza, it wasn't able to even, reconstruct or even, again, like for young Palestinians, especially to even envision a future outside of this cage in which they're born in. So this is the very harrowing reality that Israel has specifically designed. And in terms of, and for Egypt's presidency, whether it was Mubarak or Sisi today, and with the gap of the Muslim Brotherhood in the middle, they despise political Islamists. They themselves are trying to fight them back, in Egyptian territory, including in the Sinai. So they're no friends of Hamas. And for all the lip service that Egypt also provides for the Palestinian cause, they also have geopolitical interests, and they're more interested in the alliance with Israel in many respects. and its backing, and especially the backing of the United States, compared to really assisting the Palestinian people. And it fluctuates, and sometimes the presidents have, like Sisi now, is like concerned about how the Egyptian public will respond to this, to what's happening right now. But these are the complex games where Palestinians are kind of, especially those in Gaza, are really just kept hostage by the geopolitical games.
So one thing I want to be attentive to in this conversation is the way that the narratives and the experiences behind those narratives conflict. And so I think the dominant Israeli narrative, it's fair to say, is something like, in 2005, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Gazans choose Hamas. Palestinians, more broadly in 2006, choose Hamas for parliament, but it ends up being in Gaza where that is sustained. Hamas is an organization that is an existential security threat to Israel. The organization, as you say, known for the suicide bombings, which are a generational trauma for Israelis. And so Gaza needs to be treated as a kind of hostile space, right? An existential threat. So that, I think, is the way Israelis see it, or at least Jewish Israelis see it. What is the dominant Palestinian narrative here? I recognize that might overlap with some things you've said, but I just want to try to put it in one place.
I mean, it's a convenient narrative for Israelis to kind of center it around Hamas and the center around terrorism. But the Gaza Strip existed before Hamas was established in the 80s. Right now in the Israeli mindset, there's that conflation or that excuse of using kind of like an armed political group to be able to decimate an entire society, I think really needs to be broken down. And a lot of people abroad, sadly, are sort of buying into it. And just to put this into context as well, it's you have, let's say, kind of three streams or models in which politics can be waged that we're seeing right now. So you have Hamas, which is stuck with armed struggle, armed violence, or quote-unquote terrorism, as is defined abroad by Israel. You have Fatah, which, especially since the Oslo Accords and under Mahmoud Abbas's reign, has focused on kind of leading the political struggle through like diplomacy, through going to the UN, going to the ICC, focusing on these international forums, all while still keeping to the provisions of the Oslo Accords, like security coordination with the Israeli military, keeping its end of the bargain by playing that game. But what they're finding is that even that is now being defined as diplomatic terrorism, that even the PA's model is actually basically roundly dismissed, is roundly demonized, and you still have the same occupation, not even the same, it's even an entrenching occupation, and that the PA has now become this convenient subcontractor to this regime in the West Bank. And then you have, let's say, a third model of Palestinian politics, of like a boycott, divestment, and sanctions, using literally the nonviolent methods that all of us were kind of taught are the best way to go, are very moral and righteous, and that is coercion without the same kind of coercion of armed struggle. And what Palestinians are finding is that when you practice that, you're demonized also as terrorists and demonized even worse as anti-Semites, because you're using a nonviolent method to try to achieve your rights and to try to weaken the structures that allow the Israeli occupation to take place. Now, if all of these are defined as unacceptable, not just by Israel, but and especially in a lot of Western countries which are criminalizing boycotts, and they're not giving Fatah and the PA the diplomatic victories or providing them anything beyond just money to supply to the Palestinians, and at the same time, they're violently going against Hamas, Palestinians are saying, so what options do we have left? And the only thing that has actually ever really incurred that cost is Hamas's armed struggle. Like, this is one of the perspectives that's very much in the public's mind. And even though the cost of that is borne on Palestinians, it's like, are we going to wait for a slow annihilation or a quick one? Are we going to put up a fight or are we not going to put up a fight? So these are the kind of debates that are happening right now. And Hamas is very conscious of this. Like, as I said, they tried to play the political game back in 2005 and 2006. And what they experienced was a complete rebuttal. They even tried, for example, the Great March of Return and facilitating this march that happened back in 2018, that went on 2019, to try to push against the Gaza fence and this massive civil disobedience and this massive march of really hundreds of thousands of people. And Israeli snipers either killed or maimed hundreds and then injured thousands of Palestinians, and the world just sat by and again defined it as terrorists. So Hamas is also navigating all this and examining it, and it's making its judgments based on that nothing is actually working. And for Palestinians now as well, it's like in the wider public, like I said, even those who disagree with the movement or its decisions, but they're asking themselves, like, well, what do we have left? And what Palestinians are realizing is that it's not about the method, it is our very existence that is deemed unacceptable by the Israelis and by a lot of Western powers and people who support them, who see us as disposable and Jewish Israelis as the ones who need to be protected and whose rights need to be met first.
There's also a more complicated reality that emerges than, I think, in the Israeli narrative between Israel itself and Hamas. You've talked about your colleague Turk Bakoni's idea of the violent equilibrium that emerges. What is the violent equilibrium?
The equilibrium, as Tarek describes it, is this kind of like almost de facto arrangement that was established whereby Hamas and Israel understood that they were going to get into regular confrontations, like armed military confrontations, and that this was almost like a form of communication when, for example, the blockade became a bit too untenable, when there were Israeli domestic political issues, that armed violence would be the ways that they renegotiate some of the conditions of the blockade. But that on the whole, the idea was that every now and then they'll negotiate in this tactic, but that the quote-unquote calm is what would become the sort of status quo. But this itself was kind of a myth, that this idea of calm, because for the Israelis, they experienced, for the most part, calm. And from the north to the south, most Israelis were able to go about their lives. But in Gaza, the siege is the constant. The structural violence of besiegement is the constant. In the Israeli mindset, this equilibrium was fantastic because they just almost pretended as if Gaza was just static. And they began to believe that actually this kind of de facto arrangement could last forever, that they didn't need to come up with some alternative solution, that this itself was a solution. And this is where it's also very much connected to the way that the occupation is managed in the West Bank, where you have this kind of subcontractor in the PA, that they just govern a few things in the population centers, but it's the Israeli state that controls everything. So it became like an integral part of this maintenance of an apartheid regime, in the same way that we would understand the Bantustans and apartheid in South Africa or elsewhere. But that equilibrium was always very shaky. That equilibrium was always came at the cost of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, in their daily life, and certainly during those bouts of military violence. And October 7th, I think, has very much erased that equilibrium. It's very much erased that arrangement, that Hamas, for whatever reasons, could no longer hold it up. And it has also shocked the Israeli system to understand that something else has to replace it. But unfortunately, what we're seeing now is something even worse in that regard.
What I find useful about the idea of the equilibrium is it gets at, I think, a more complicated reality here, which is that the two sides are in relationship and what they do affects the other. And there's sort of two quotes that stick in my mind here. So Netanyahu is widely reported to have said at a Likud meeting when he is asked about allowing Qatari money to go to Hamas, he says, quote, "Anyone who wants to thwart the establishment of a Palestinian state must support bolstering Hamas and transferring money to Hamas." He goes on to say it's part of our strategy. And then Bezalel Smotrich, who is now the finance minister in Netanyahu's government and has a lot of control over the West Bank, in 2015, he says, "The Palestinian Authority is a burden. Hamas is an asset." Mm-hmm. One reason I think that's important is that the relationship between the Israeli government and Hamas becomes more complicated than simple enmity. Is there a way that both sides are benefiting from each other prior to the major attacks?
I think they all benefited in many respects. And even those benefits came at a massive asymmetry, but everyone had something to gain from the quote-unquote status quo. For someone like Smotrich, the PA is this very frustrating partner. The fact that even though they're almost on an Israeli payroll, but they can still go and sort of go to these diplomatic forums, etc., and say all these things about Israel. And for Smotrich, it's just like infuriating. But especially when he's come into power, he's realizing how useful they are, because they're actually keeping a hold, for the most part, on the Palestinian people, such that the Israeli army doesn't have to do it. It's like a partner that you need, but one that you have to allow to launch these kind of diplomatic offensives against the state. Hamas is just nice, pure and simple in the Israeli establishment. Like, it is the embodiment of an evil. It is a clear-cut enemy that you can basically inflict all the violence that you want upon it. Like, you can't really do that with the PA. They know that Fatah always needs it. And they just find the right sort of equilibrium in that respect to keep the PA alive and to keep it functioning, because the PA is so dependent. And this is why even to this day, the Fatah leadership can't exist outside of the structures of the occupation right now. And for Hamas, the Gaza Strip allowed it to become almost like a fiefdom of its own, that it gave it some sense of power, and that it was able to create this kind of more sturdy base for it to establish itself, to establish its armed wing more, and to try to tackle the occupation with more control than they otherwise would have. So that arrangement worked for them in that respect. And this is kind of the irony, again, of even a group like Hamas, which, for all its talk of resistance, also appreciated the status quo in many respects. And all of this fed into this divide and conquer strategy. It's your typical story of that for the Israelis, this was a great way to keep the Palestinian leadership divided, to have them each have those, separate fiefdoms, and to try to entrench the idea that the West Bank is separate from Gaza, even in the minds of Palestinians, and that the Israelis could manage all of this from above. So yeah, everyone stood to gain for it. And, this is what created the quote-unquote calm, especially for Israeli Jewish society. And the violence that was inflicted on Palestinians on a regular basis, including against Gaza with massive wars, even despite occasional rocket attacks or even militant attacks in Israeli cities, that was kind of seen as both physically and psychologically distant for the Israeli state and for most Jewish Israelis. It's very much part of a doctrine, especially led by Netanyahu, to really erase the occupation, from the Israeli mindset, out of sight and out of mind. And I think a lot of people just assumed that this could be sustainable. But again, what happened on October 7th, I think, showed the folly of that. And this is never something static, that even though Palestinian elites can sometimes gain from the system, in the end, the Palestinian public, with the pressures that they're putting on their leaderships, both Hamas and Fatah, and just making the occupation itself untenable, I think is proof that apartheid can't work forever like this.
There has been this overwhelming sense that what Israel suffered on 10/7, among other things, was an intelligence failure. But the more I see the reporting on this, the more that doesn't actually seem right to me. They had actually a lot of intelligence. They saw a lot of the training happening in open air. What they had was a political analysis failure. They believed that Hamas was relatively comfortable in the position it was in, that it was not going to want to risk this kind of war with Israel. They did not think Hamas would do something like this. Not that they didn't see them preparing for it, but they didn't believe that they would want to upend the equilibrium in the way they did. So at this point, what is your sense of what they wanted? Why didn't Hamas just want to stay in the position they were in, where Israel was not trying to destroy it root and branch?
You hit at something very important here, whereby, even beyond political analysis, there's a deeper psychology that has really taken hold of the Israeli political and military establishment and Israeli society, which, like I said, that they thought that this could keep going forever. They couldn't imagine that Hamas wanted anything differently. And that, yes, aside from your occasional confrontations, the idea of Gaza being out of sight, out of mind became the norm. And so, yeah, I think for them, as much as it was a military shock, there's a psychological shock, a barrier really being broken by the fact that Hamas told the Israelis in very violent fashion, we no longer want this to be the case. Now, as to why Hamas decided to pick this moment and even these methods, there are multiple layers of this. In the end, it's not just about Gaza, it's about the wider Palestinian question. You've been seeing, not just in the past years, but even just in the past months, just for a smaller scope, under this Israeli far-right government, which has been very explicit about what it wants to do to the occupied territories, especially in the West Bank, of full force annexation, a judicial coup, which is very much designed and seen as a phase towards the full absorption of the West Bank, a very unabashed envisioning of expelling as many Palestinians as possible, especially by people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir. They're seeing, even before this month, you had West Bank communities, rural ones and villages, who were being chased out by escalating settler violence, all backed up by the army. And all this is happening at the same time that you have Arab states, including, the expectation that Saudi Arabia was going to be joining on to the Abraham Accords, and sort of really taking one of the last pieces of regional leverage that the Palestinian cause still had. And this is in addition to kind of local pressures of Palestinians in Gaza, who, especially in the past few months, under this total blockade, are still demanding of Hamas as the de facto government to provide more support for basic services, especially with electricity, which, is almost impossible to meet in conditions of siege, but that they were still turning to the Hamas government to provide for that in some form or another. So you have these local and national and regional factors which could not make the status quo kind of last any longer. And even though obviously this military operation, these assaults were planned well in advance and took a lot of intelligence gathering, etc., it's enwrapped very much in the fact that the Palestinian question and Palestinians were increasingly under an existential threat. We're experiencing it in a very expedited form now, but this was happening for months and years on end. And so I think for a group like Hamas, I mean, again, I can't speak for it, but I think they made the calculation that something had to give because Hamas could no longer survive as a local government, and the Palestinian cause could no longer survive under this far-right government. It could no longer survive if all the Arab governments were turning away from it.
What is Hamas's sense of Israel's psychology, and in particular its relationship to loss? And I think this is an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but I do think it needs to be part of trying to figure out what happened here. So Nathan Thrall, who was the lead international crisis group analyst on the region, he wrote a book some number of years ago called The Only Language I Understand, arguing that both Israelis and Palestinians tend to make their concessions under the threat of force. You've done interviews and work around moments when fighting erupts between Hamas and Israel and the sense that Hamas actually often does get concessions in those moments. Hamas got a lot out of a prisoner exchange not too long ago under Netanyahu, and many people think that was part of their incentive to take many more civilian hostages this time, and of course military hostages, in the hopes of winning a lot of people back in another prisoner exchange. How much do you think that Hamas thought this would actually get it concessions versus how much do you think it understood that it was going to bring down a hellacious war?
To be honest, it's really hard to say, and I've been talking with a lot of people of exactly what Hamas thought it was going to get out of this. And there are two elements to this operation as well. You know, there's the one side of it is the military nature of it, of like breaking out of the fence, of attacking military targets. Like this was kind of like the first phase of what happened on October 7th in the morning hours of that. And this is what Palestinians are really have been mostly kind of looking to, as just like that the group had the capacity to actually break out of this cage and that they could actually completely humiliate the Israeli military, that it wasn't as invincible as everyone was making it out to be, and that there was a way to shatter out of it. But then that second side of that, of course, are these horrific massacres that happen in the southern communities. I mean, I can't speak to how much they were directed. I can't speak to how much, was sort of like, not just in the question of like a fog of war, but also the rage of war that these militants also launched some of the massacres that they did like that. We'll only get to know this, in the coming weeks, months, and years, as we investigate this more. But it's just unclear entirely what it was. Or were they just trying to play a certain card just to say, like, just change something? Like, just change anything out of the equilibrium? Did they have a more concerted plan in coordination with groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, hoping that that would serve enough deterrence? Like, there's no way Hamas did this thinking that the Israelis were not going to respond so viciously. And we're not sure how much they thought they could get away with in the military assault in the first place. And so there's just so much uncertainty, and we're still in that fog as we speak. So I really can't speak to it. And even now we're hearing different conflicting things sometimes from members of the Hamas movement, from the political bureau, from the armed wing, from the people in Gaza versus people outside. So it's been very messy to see all this. But in many respects, putting aside all these questions, there's no doubt that I think Hamas, for the better and the worse, has really thrown everyone in the region back onto the Palestinian question. At a time where it was really being marginalized, Hamas has very violently forced all the Arab states to rethink their alliances with Israel and to realize that the Palestinians still have political cards to play, even when done in such brutal fashion. And it's been very complex to kind of navigate their full calculations about this. But I think even just the very idea to show the Israelis that you can no longer go on like this, I think for Hamas was also like an important message to send.
Yeah, I have really struggled with whether or not I even want to talk about this question, but I feel very uncomfortable. And in some ways, as somebody who covered more in this region 15 years ago, 10 years ago than I do now, somewhat personally ashamed by something that you just gestured at, which is that there were big efforts to draw attention to the conditions that Palestinians will live under, the March of Return, various things in the divestment movement. There have been other efforts. Abbas has given big speeches at the UN. And the savagery of Hamas's attack seems to have worked in the sense of focusing a lot more attention on the lived experience of Palestinians. And I think that needs to make a lot of us who care about this conflict wonder about our own behavior over the past 10, 15 years. I don't think that it absolves or justifies or excuses anything Hamas did, which is why this is difficult to talk about. But I think that it casts a much more negative light on things that we weren't doing before.
Yeah. And this is really an absolutely vital question. And just putting aside even just the questions of the immoralities that we've been seeing, not just by Hamas, but also what is being inflicted now in Gaza by the Israeli state and the army. I mean, this comes back to what I was saying earlier, whereby Palestinians have tried everything. Really, they've picked up their guns, they picked up their pens, they picked up their banners. Everything you can think of, Palestinians have tried. And it's not an exaggeration to say how much Palestinians feel that they've been duped by the lessons of history, the international community, which even governments that claim to support their rights and claim to be, on their side in some form or another. And what they're experiencing is that it doesn't matter what they do, the very fact that they're Palestinian, the very fact that they are the biggest thorn in a state that is desperately trying to make itself out as a quote-unquote Jewish and democratic state is in reality not interested in their existence, whether it's in physical presence, not in their identity, and that their very existence as Palestinian Arabs is itself a threat. And when we look at foreign governments, but also the media and the public, and where they've also just demonized anything and everything that Palestinians do. And it's become very clear that Jewish Israelis matter more in much of the Western world, especially. I think in the global South, there's a very different understanding of this, but Israel thrives off and is very much propped up by political, military, economic arrangements by, what still remains one of the foremost global superpower and European states that have such a hold to enable Israel to do this with such impunity. And so, I think these questions really need to be asked by the world, like how much has, especially like Western publics and Western governments, facilitated that? Not just facilitated the apartheid on the ground, but the apartheid in the mind. That how much do we actually put Jewish Israeli rights first before Palestinians? How disposable are Palestinians compared to Jewish Israelis? I'm not saying just to say flip it. It needs to be rectified to understand Palestinians as humans.
The cost of this attention is that Hamas has incurred an overwhelming Israeli reprisal, and predictably so, against Gazans, and possibly we'll see what happens in the West Bank. It could spread from there. Many, many, many people are dying. Many, many, many people are losing their homes. What trends, what tendencies do you see in the way Hamas's attack is now seen by Palestinians in the Gaza or in the West Bank? How do they understand what Hamas did?
I mean, it's also been hard to gauge, that's Palestinians in a way don't even have time to reflect on it, especially in Gaza. They're focused on survival. There was no time to even process what had happened on October 7th before the bombs started falling. And even in the West Bank, you're seeing a massive escalation in military settler violence. And so they're seeing the kind of immediate aftermath of that. And even inside Israel, Palestinian citizens, who make up a fifth of the Israeli citizenry, are also just in a total paralyzing fear from Jewish Israeli society, from the police, from the Israeli institutions. And the thing is, we've seen these trends before, even those who maybe disagreed with Hamas or even found the massacres to be kind of morally abhorrent, they still understand why Hamas is still keeping to military struggle, and that even if they disagree with it, they understand the context behind it. And this is a big difference between, you don't have to defend it, but you need to understand why it's the case. You need to understand why political violence, even murderous violence, is used in such contexts. And I know this is a very delicate subject and many people might be immediately outraged by it, but it can't be that the way we've spent trying to understand the logic or even just the ideas behind such political violence in other contexts, somehow all of that is erased when it comes to the Palestinians. And so in the community, I think if there's ever space, that there's going to be huge debates. And there are debates. There are, whether it's in private living rooms or whether it's in forums, even Palestinian citizens of Israel have a bit more ability to even debate this about the question, again, of armed struggle and what's been going on now. But everyone is in such survival mode because the state and society has really turned on them that it's been hard to really gauge what everyone's reflecting on this. But what we do know is just the fact that everyone could expect such wanton violence from the Israeli state, especially in regards to Gaza. The fact that everyone could predict that there was Israeli settler and state violence in huge parts of the occupied West Bank. That still needs to be part of the conversation. Okay, you were talking about a piece of violence that happened on October 7th. What about the daily violence that happened before? What about the daily violence that happened afterwards? And if that's still being ignored, then for Palestinians, it's that sense that we're on our own, that at least someone is exposing to people that The violence is there, whether or not you're actually attentive to it. The violence is there even when Jewish Israelis are not being killed or massacred. So this for Palestinians is still that dominant thought.
There's a tendency when you want to talk about how this could be better to move to the question of state-based frameworks. 2 states, 1 state, big picture settlements. You've been pretty critical of the tendency to talk about this in terms of state-based solutions. Tell me why.
I think one of the biggest lessons I take from the height of the decolonization era, of the past century, is how much the state, first of all, it entraps political struggles in many respects, or how much of a fake identity it is in many respects, that it really limits and disrupts our understanding of history, of how societies live and exist and can organize themselves outside of these very arbitrary borders, and they are in the end arbitrary. Even historical Palestine was once integrated into the region. And yes, you had the idea of provinces and you had different kinds of regional identities. There was a much more fluid construct of identity that existed. But then I think also the part of the era of the anti-colonial period was that for them, nationalism became the engine for your liberation. And that itself is still very exclusionary. The idea that you need to have these very rigid borders is still very exclusionary. And I think we can be better than that. And it's a bit of a tragedy that Palestine is still one of those it's a struggle that's very much out of its place. It's like 19th century ideologies and a 20th century conflict in the 21st century world. And even though we're seeing these kind of resurgences of nationalisms and, state borders and all these aspects, like there are ways to imagine something differently. And I worry that the Palestinian struggle and Palestinianness and Palestinian identity has been so enwrapped in Arab nationalism, that I think we can look back to our own history and our own literature as like to remind ourselves that there's something broader. What are local identities? Like in Palestine, whether you're from Nablus or from Gaza or from Haifa, the local identities were a huge part of our daily existence. And so there's something about statehood and nationalism which kind of erases that a lot of times. And people know this in America. People know this all over the world. It misguides us by just asserting ourselves in that kind of national state identity. And this for me is also the case in Israel-Palestine. I mean, and Zionism in that respect, political Zionism, is also for me that kind of archaic idea whereby they can only envision Jewish safety with this hyper-militarized, powerful state, and that it needs to be exclusionary, and that Palestine needs to be only for one people, for the Jewish people. And that itself is ethnocentric. That itself is what facilitates apartheid. And so I don't think the answer to imagining something outside of Zionism as it's manifested today needs to be another kind of nationalism. It could be a state that could be broken down more. What is Jewish existence outside of the state of Israel? Outside in terms of in the land, but away from those constructs. And to reorganize ourselves and rethink our identities in different ways. So like, how do you reflect the people on the ground? Like Israeli society itself, Jewish Israelis will tell you first and foremost that, they can hardly sometimes find the things that really unite them. Jewish Israeli society is just as diverse as any other. Life in Tel Aviv is nothing like life in Jerusalem or life in the south or in the north. In the same way that for Palestinians as well, it's a massive diversity. So how do you reflect that diversity by actually reflecting the people on the ground and not some political idea that tries to pretend that we're on the same page in this one single territory that needs to be cut off from everybody else? How do we envision a more decentralized model of existence? How do we think about regions? How do we think about cities as leading our political and economic ways of life? I'm only sort of vaguely scratching these surfaces, and there are people who have done a lot of amazing work on this. But I just don't want us to be trapped by these ideas, which we can see in every part of the world. It ended up becoming its own oppressive system on its own people. So I want us to break out of that. But if the answer to that is not only that, we get attacked for doing so, we're even called anti-Semites because we're actually envisioning something that's not a Jewish state. But especially in the Western world, where if I say I want a state for all its citizens, or I want a land for all its inhabitants, and the response is that you're asking for the destruction of the Jewish people, I don't have the space to even imagine that. And I'm being demonized for doing so. So I think trying to provide the legitimate spaces for Palestinians to think about that and to say why Zionism is a problem and to say that we can imagine something outside of nationalism and statehood, I think is much more realistic to who we are, much more realistic to the future that we want, and to create something much better.
I want to go back to the question of equilibriums because I found that idea holding in my own mind recently. And I think the reason it has attained a certain power for me is that what I'm seeing in the media coverage of what's happening in Israel and in Gaza right now, what I'm seeing in my own community, in my own life, is the tendency to think in terms of sides when everything is actually an equilibrium. I'll give an example that's maybe a little bit personal. I'm Jewish. My natural identification is with Israel. A lot of the people around me are that way too. But the thing that I see happening is that as people experience more anti-Semitism, on the left, or they see it on social media, it pushes them to a more closed off, scared, and in some ways brutal space, right? The more scared people get, the more they're willing to countenance in order to restore security. The idea that there's like a static choice, where they were a month ago is not where they are now. They have changed. The equilibrium has shifted. So you have to think in terms of the ways in which what one side is doing changes the other. And to me, what's true here, or what seems true, is that the thing that is the dominant value on the Israeli side is security. And the dominant demand on the Palestinian side is freedom. Now, it's not the only demand of either side, but one of the big questions for me in how to think about this as an equilibrium, but about how to think about a better equilibrium, is how do you get more security and more freedom, as opposed to seeing those two things as zero-sum, which is, I think, how they're often seen, where more freedom for Palestinians would mean less security for Israelis because Hamas could plan more attacks. More security for Israelis would mean less freedom for Palestinians because Israel would clamp down on control and surveillance and drones. That how do you find more positive sum equilibriums as opposed to thinking about this in terms of, which side do you end up on? Because there's not going to be just one side at the end of it all. You have to find some kind of dynamic balance.
That's a tough question. It starts by recognizing that what you describe as like the equilibrium on the larger scale for the better part of the past century has existed and been legitimated on a sort of asymmetric plane. So the equilibrium that we've been known since Zionism came about is that Zionism got the better part of the equilibrium, where there was great power backing and being able to fulfill that vision and even being able to use violence and even international support to legitimate that vision at the expense of Palestinians. And even as we were talking about like the idea that the two-state solution is somehow the equilibrium for how to resolve this conflict, is that it's not. Even the two-state solution as we envision it in the past 30 years especially, is telling Palestinians to accept maybe about a quarter or a fifth of their homeland as their state, not their belonging and their connections, their identity to the wider region. And for Israelis, yes, the idea of security and freedom must come through a powerful state. And not just through a powerful state, it requires ethno-racial supremacy. The tragedy of the Palestinian struggle is that, there were a lot of debates and visions to put something different from the ethnocentric model for the future. That our struggle itself also began to kind of think that the equilibrium point is through that. And this is why the PLO acquiesced to the two-state solution, acquiesced to Oslo. But I think this young generation of Palestinians are saying they're not interested in having just a state with a capital to play the same international game like everyone else. Like, the conversation for them is, am I getting my equal rights? Am I getting the right to return to my homeland? Am I able to live in my land without another society determining how many rights I get to have? As much as we want to try also think about this, like how do we lead this in a positive way, it also requires, sort of negative force in a way, that we need to bring the Israeli parameters down and to elevate the Palestinian parameters up in order to create a different kind of equilibrium. Like, that's the power asymmetry that needs to be dealt with. And I know we're kind of speaking in a bit of sort of kind of meta and conceptual, but this really manifests in everything. As long as that power asymmetry is still in place, you won't get a meaningful equilibrium. And Palestinians will always be worse off on it. And so I think this is why Palestinians are so strident about it, whereby the lip service to equality, to human rights, international law, to the self-determination of people, to even refugees being allowed to return, that somehow Palestinians are being asked to waive all that because Jews need their own state with laws and policies that enable Jewish privilege above everybody else. That's the equilibrium that needs to be shifted. Like, it needs to be redrawn entirely. And I think American Jews and Jews in the diaspora and people abroad have a huge role to play in this. And to not only tell Israelis like why an apartheid regime is not the guarantee of your survival, and also to enable Palestinians to say that a vision of real equality and full restoration of everyone's rights and belonging to the land is what is supported.
Well, I'm an American Jew and a Jew of the diaspora. And the thing that I see when I have this conversation with Israeli friends or sources or people in Israel, the thing that I'm asked and that I don't honestly have a good answer to is that all sounds nice. That all would be great. But that isn't what Palestinians want. They want us gone. And at times when our politics have been softer and the peaceniks stronger and labor stronger, and maybe it wasn't perfect, and, obviously there are claims and counterclaims about every single negotiation that has happened, but there were suicide bombings in cafes and discotheques, and there is no safety for us in equality. That equality can only take place in a context of safety. But when Hamas is a strong force, when, there are polls that say, armed resistance is the preferred path forward, that there's no way to move towards that because we will die. And I mean, the fear of annihilation, the fear of eradication, lurks deep in the Jewish soul. And that's not going away, and for real reason. And so I'm curious not that this is on you to answer, but I'm curious what you would tell me to answer, right? When they say, that all sounds nice, but the first thing we need to be able to guarantee is that our children aren't killed. What inequality in a movement towards equality, given stated positions and given factions that, we really do see, allows for that to be also something that makes Jewish Israelis safer, not less safe?
As much as myself and my people come at the cost of this, I understand why Jewish Israelis have, the way that Zionism has manifested itself, I understand why that's come about, just psychologically speaking. But if that's the case, then it begins with being a little bit honest exactly about what the political project is in Israel. That if the lesson of Jewish history, of anti-Semitism, very violent anti-Semitism, all the way up to the Holocaust, if the lesson of that, and this is what Zionism kind of began to take hold especially, that the lesson is to become powerful overlords, then we need to be a bit blunt about that. Beginning with that Israel actually is not a democratic state. Israel is not a light unto the nations. Israel is an ethno-nationalist colonial project who can only see survival by being an ethno-nationalist colonial project. And if that's their decision, that's their decision. But one of the most infuriating things is that everyone's pretending that Israel is something that it's not. And what's been darkly refreshing about this far-right government is that they've also been very unapologetic, saying we don't need to apologize. We do want laws and policies that weed out Palestinians. We do want laws and policies that kick them out of their land. We do want a purely Jewish supremacist state, regardless of democracy or vote. The democracy does not matter. And this has been the practice. This has been the experience of Palestinians. If that's the case, then I think like for American Jews, they need to come face to face with that reality and stop kidding themselves that Israel is that democratic model of Jewish self-determination. It's an apartheid model. And the American Jews then need to ask themselves, are those really where their values align? They talk about equality in the United States, but ethno-nationalism in Israel-Palestine, is that consistent with your values? But if American Jews can't square that circle, then they need to ask exactly well, yes, sometimes there is a side. It's not about being with the Palestinians versus Israelis. It's about, am I on the side of genuine equality for everyone, or am I on the side of supremacy?
But see, in a way, I think that was the easy question. And I'll use myself as the example here. Over the last 10 years, Israel became something that many American Jews could not support. And I think you see that in polling of younger American Jews. I mean, the number who would say that what we were seeing in Israel was an apartheid had gone to levels that would have been unimaginable in the 90s. And for a lot of us, as Israeli society chose people like Ben-Gvir, as the Netanyahu government moved further and further right, a lot of us disengaged. I mean, it wasn't a society listening to us. Being Jewish gives me no traction on Israeli politics. And so to say that I don't support this project, I don't support what this has become, I mean, that in a way was easy. I don't want to in any way be trying to draw some kind of hopeful picture in the sky here because I don't feel hopeful. I do think, though, that there is at least some chance that the failure of that far-right project, the failure of Israel completely embracing an oppressive ethno-nationalism to even provide the one thing that it promised, which was security, possibly reopens the door to something else. Now, that thing could be worse. That thing could be no different, right? I don't come to politics with a teleological belief that it bends towards justice. Certainly don't come to this conflict with that. But I think the question within the question of re-engagement that a lot of us are trying to struggle and understand is that you do need to be able to speak of security, right? Equality needs to come alongside security, not as a deal. Again, this is why I've become interested in the language of equilibriums as something that emerges organically from shifting factions, shifting power, shifting ways people relate to each other. Different leaders, right? I mean, it has happened in other conflicts and societies. I mean, things end and things change. And so I think a lot of what you're saying, certainly prior to 10/7 was right. And I think, again, the kind of shame that I alluded to earlier is that for a lot of us, the decision was to just kind of stop paying attention to it. Because I don't live in Israel, and I don't support what Israel has been doing, and I don't support what their government has become, and I don't have to live under it. If that is not sustainable, and I think a lot of us have had the experience that, there is a deep tie here, and so tragedy and trauma, both in Israel and in Gaza and in Palestine, watching this become everybody's horror forces a kind of re-engagement. And I don't have an answer on this. I am genuinely struggling with it, right? I open the inbox of the show all the time and I get flooded by Israeli emails saying, yeah, look, this is all nice, but we need to be safe and you have no answer for that. And so that I think is a thing that I'm struggling to even explore on the show, which is forget a deal. Just are there factions, are there possibilities that begin to move towards positive sum? I mean, it seems to me that it should be possible that equality should bring security. That's been true in many other places. It doesn't seem impossible here, but I don't know how to convince anyone of that. And of course, it's all easy to say from a podcast studio in New York.
I mean, I can give a real example to show that there's a different model that's being practiced as we speak. And it's a model that's very imperfect for a host of reasons. And that is the experience of Palestinian citizens of Israel or Arab citizens of Israel, who, like I said, make up 20% of the citizenry. I'm one of them. So, I mean, for people maybe who are not so familiar, basically after the Nakba of 48, you still had about 150,000 Palestinians on the Israeli side of the border, out of the armistice lines, and the state, for kind of a host of complex reasons, gave them Israeli citizenship. And we've had the right to vote since 1948, 1950. And in theory, we're supposed to be given equal rights, but in reality, since day one, there's a massive legal, political, policy infrastructure that makes us second-class citizens, to put it nicely. And that discrimination, that inequality is not just something about historical gaps, it's an active constant, especially even in the past couple of years. I mean, there's a lot to unpack on this, but this community identifies itself as Palestinian Arab that was able to stay in their historical homeland, even as their historical homeland was completely usurped and transformed. But this community knows Hebrew. They've been exposed to Jewish society as a civilian society, differently from Palestinians in the occupied territories, who mostly see Israelis as settlers and soldiers, up front. We're exposed to their language, to their culture, to their religion, to their ideas, and despite our inequality and despite the discrimination and despite the demonization and despite being described as demographic threats and enemies and what have you, and even in our second-class status, we can still understand Jewish Israeli society and come to different kinds of arrangements and terms, whereby we're even working in the same socioeconomic centers. Palestinian citizens vote in the same parliament, Knesset. There are models and methods to this. We're a community that really defies the green line. Like, even before Gaza was under blockade, Palestinian citizens, to this day, we still have family and national connections to people in Gaza, in the West Bank, even refugees in exile. The West Bank is part and parcel of daily life of Palestinian citizens. Like, the border does not operate on us. And doesn't operate on anyone with an Israeli license plate or a blue ID card. But we're actually showing that there's a life that actually can go between the river and the sea, that can actually be inside the homeland and to go about politics and the way of life, which isn't just this demonized idea that, oh, the Palestinians are just going to come to kill us. And that, I think, is a very useful model in the community that, for all its flaws and imperfections and all the internal issues, and it's still operating in a state that still wants to see them gone for the most part, but that we still have this space to provide something different. And I should also just add that, Palestinian citizens have a lot of diversity, even politically, from your secular to your Islamists and from your nationalists to your communists and what have you. But the underlying core of all their political ideas is centered around what they describe as like national equality or a state for all its citizens. But that experience, again, it's almost like a leading model for what the Palestinian struggle could be and what a real future vision can be. But it's also evidence that for most Jewish Israelis, they cannot accept that. They see the idea of full equality as a threat to the Jewish state. And it's not just something about in theory, like in practice, from the Knesset all the way down, when Palestinian citizens even try to practice that, let alone even propose it as a political idea, it's roundly rejected. And even in spite of everything, Palestinian citizens, even now after October 7th, their leaders and the public are still coming out to say that there's a different way around this. But here again, and whether it's American Jews or even Jewish Israelis, if they can't even tolerate the idea that we need to break down the quote-unquote Jewish state in order to create a state for all its citizens, a place of real equality, then it's on others to meet us and to meet our equilibrium point. But in search of any kind of optimistic sort of light, I think that community is an important place to start.
I think I'll leave it there. Always our final question. What are 3 books you would recommend to the audience?
One that has been very much on my mind since I read it was actually East-West Street by Philip Sands. It's an amazing book, which I read a couple of years ago and is really just stuck in my mind day in, day out, and even more so over these past weeks. For those who haven't read it, it beautifully traces both the personal family history and also the history of of anti-Semitism and the Jewish experience in Europe and how people thought about these things. But basically how it was also enwrapped with 2 of the kind of architects of the idea of genocide, Raphael Lemkin and Hirsch Lauterbach. That genocide is also about the idea of erasing the essence of a community, of destroying them even in part, and that death is a means for something almost more nefarious. And it's been ringing in my head a lot because of, even if people think that's somehow extreme, what we're seeing in Gaza just kept bringing me back to that, and how even a lot of the psychologies that played in with the characters of this book, how it still resonates even for me, and how it resonates for Palestinians, and that even the people who seem like this is kind of like unacceptable to even begin to compare, I urge you to read or reread that book. And for those who haven't read it, I would always recommend Orientalism by Edward Said, which is so formative for me, but really helps you to also understand even some of the premises of why Palestinians in the Arab world, how they understand the way that the West has looked at them in the structures of power and how ideas can manifest themselves, and just the history of colonialism and how that still operates to this day. And the third book is The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. Anything by Baldwin, to be honest. The way that he just captures the experience of racism just resonates so much for Palestinians. And just his command of the language is just so gripping, and the ferocity with which every line that he writes just carries. I'm really not kidding when I say Palestinians have really looked to him in many respects of just like being able to articulate that. And I would highly recommend reading him at this moment to understand what it means to be a community that's so heavily discriminated and marginalized. Even though it's different contexts, Palestinians can see all that Baldwin wrote kind of word for word and feel what he wrote word for word. So yeah, those would be my 3.
Amjad Iraqi, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ezra.
This episode of The Ezra Klein Show was produced by Roland Hu. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris with Kate Sinclair and Mary Marge Locker. Our senior engineer is Jeff Geld. Our senior editor is Claire Gordon. The show's production team also includes Emma Fagau and Kristen Lin. We have original music by Isaac Jones and Carol Saburo, audience strategy by Christina Samuelewski and Shannon Busta. The executive producer of New York Times Opinion Audio is Annie Rose Strasser, and special thanks to Sonia Herrero.